Okay guys, so now we're going to talk about tissues in the body, and no, that does not mean like Kleenex or Puffs tissues. It means tissue types. This is a little confusing. I made this one because I thought the PowerPoint from F.A. Davis was even more confusing. This is a tough topic to wrap your head around. So I hope this PowerPoint helps you. And again, when we have class, you will definitely be able to ask questions. So in your body, there are four main types of tissues. There's epithelial, connective, muscle tissue, and nervous tissue. Each of these tissue types have subtypes, and some of those subtypes have more subtypes, and some of those even have more subtypes. So it does get a little confusing. Hopefully I've broken it down pretty well. Let's first talk about epithelial tissue, or epithelium. This is a type of tissue. It covers the body, and it lines the body's cavities and organs. It forms sheets that cover the whole body, like the skin. It lines cavities. It does not have blood vessels, so it gets its oxygen and nutrients from nearby blood vessels because it doesn't have its own. It adheres to connective tissue on the bottom. That's the foundation for it. And then there's a glue-like layer called the basement membrane that connects the epithelial tissue to its connective tissue. So you have the epithelial and then the basement membrane and then the connective underneath that. Excuse me. There are epithelial tissues can be classified a couple different ways. The first way is according to its shape. First is squamous. That's this one right here. You can see it's kind of flat, looks a little round, kind of like a scale, like a fish's scale. And then cuboidal, this one. And just like that name kind of implies, it's kind of cube-shaped. It's squared like a box or a cube. Columnar is taller, like a column. Again, it's usually squarish. And then transitional, and let me see, where's transitional on here? Transitional is kind of like a bunch of a variety of shapes. It can stretch, it can relax, but it's different shapes. And then it's also classified according to how they are arranged. So simple is just a single layer of cells. You can see it here. You just have just the one layer of cells, and then the connective tissue below that. Stratified means there is more than one layer of cells. And you can see that here. And you can see the top layer is they look like the squamous. The bottom layers look like the cuboidal. There's also a picture here of pseudostratified, this one right here. Excuse me again. Pseudostratified, just like the name means, it looks like it's stratified, but it's not really. The nucleus of those cells, here, they're in different at different levels, so it looks like there's more than one layer, but there's not really. And again, you can see the basement membrane right here that connects this layer of epithelial tissue to the connective tissue below it. And again, you can see transitional. This one's relaxed. This one is stretched. Sorry, I forgot to press the button again. This one's relaxed, and this one is stretched out. Okay, so here's some more illustrations of epithelial tissues. The top one, the squamous, you can see it's squamous because it's flat. And then there's simple squamous and stratified squamous. The simple squamous, you're going to find this in the alveoli of the lungs because it is one layer, so the oxygen and the carbon dioxide can easily pass through to be exchanged. The stratified squamous, and you can tell it's stratified because there's more than one layer of it. They're still flat, especially the top layer, but the bottom one kind of almost looks like it's approaching being cuboidal. Because it's several layers, it's really good at protection, and that's really one of its primary jobs. You're going to find this in the tissue lining the mouth and the esophagus, so it can protect the body against invasion by microorganisms. You also might find this as part of a layer of a skin, again, because it can protect you against microorganisms. The middle row is the cuboidal. You see on the left, simple cuboidal, and on the right, stratified cuboidal, more than one layer, and they actually do still look cuboidal. The simple is usually found in glands, It forms tubules that are adapted for secreting, so it's found in the ducts and tubules of organs like the kidneys. They can also be involved in protection because they do sometimes secrete protective substances. Because your text refers to a type of tissue called glandular epithelium. It's referring to cuboidal, if you look at the picture on page 58, and it's a tissue that's specialized because it secretes hormones. The bottom row is columnar here, simple, again, and stratified, and then we have the pseudostratified. The simple columnar looks like a column. It's a little taller than it is wide. You'll find this lining the stomach, the intestines, parts of the respiratory tract, and the lining of the fallopian tubes. Its main function is absorption, which kind of makes sense why we find it in the intestinal tract. And you can see the little cilia on the top here that help to move things along in the intestines. There's also some goblet cells thrown in here. They secrete mucus. That's as a form of protection. Because mucus in the stomach helps protect the stomach lining from the acid that's there. There's really not even much in your text about the stratified cuboidal or the stratified columnar. There are a couple other types of epithelial tissues. This one I've already mentioned, the pseudostratified. It looks like it is stratified even though it isn't, because the nucleus of these cells are in different spots. You're going to find this lining the trachea, the large bronchi, and the nasal mucosa, as well as parts of the male reproductive tract. Their primary function is to provide protection, and to also secrete mucus. Transitional epithelium is a tissue, and I don't have a picture of it. I couldn't find a good one. It contains multiple cell layers, many instances maybe up to 10 layers, often differing shapes, so it could be one with squamous and cuboidal and columnar all in it. This allows the tissue to stretch. When it stretches, the number of layers will decrease. They'll kind of combine into one. And then the cell shape changes also. This type of tissue is usually found in the urinary tract, especially in the bladder, so that it can stretch as it fills with urine, and that way it doesn't tear. The last thing about epithelial tissues is that you're also going to find this in the form of membranes or in thin sheets of tissue. There's 3 of them. The first one, thing 1, mucous membranes. They line the body surfaces that open directly to the body's exterior, like the respiratory tract, the digestive, the urinary tract, and the reproductive tracts. The type of epithelial in each mucous membrane varies according to the location. Like the esophagus contains stratified because it's tough and resists abrasions. The stomach is lined with columnar. This type of membrane secretes mucus to protect the cells and also act as a lubricant. The second thing too is a cutaneous membrane. It's also known as the skin. This is the body's largest membrane and consists of a layer of epithelium resting on a layer of connective tissue. We're going to talk more about that next week when we talk about the integumentary system. And then thing 3, the third type of epithelial membrane, is the serous membranes. These are a layer of simple squamous epithelial tissue that rests on a thin layer of areolar connective tissue. We're going to talk connective tissue in a minute. This membrane lines some of the closed body cavities and also covers many of the organs in those cavities. So, and you remember I said subtypes and subtypes and subtypes? Well, here we go. Serous membranes that line the body cavities is actually one membrane that folds over on itself and also covers the organs contained within that cavity. So the part that lines the cavity is called the parietal, and the part that folds over and covers the organ is called the visceral. There's 3 of them based on where they are in the body. The pleural membrane that surrounds each lung and lines the thoracic cavity, the pericardial membrane that surrounds the heart, and then the peritoneal membrane that lines the abdominal cavity and covers the abdominal organs. These membranes secrete serous fluid to help prevent friction as the heart beats and the lungs expand and the peristalsis happens that moves the food through your GI tract, because you don't want those membranes rubbing against each other, so they secrete a mucus that kind of keeps them lubricated. Okay, next we are going to talk about connective tissue. Connective tissue is the most abundant tissue in the body. It's the most widely distributed, and the key component of connective tissue is called the extracellular matrix. It's what allows connective tissues to be so different from each other. As you can see here, there's like 5 different kinds. The variation in the composition of that matrix is what gives the tissue its characteristics. For example, the matrix of blood is liquid, where the cartilage is firm, like firm rubber, and then bone is hard and rigid. Tendons and ligaments have a matrix that is strong and flexible. And again, here we go with subtypes and subtypes. Connect 4. First type of connective tissue we're going to talk about is fibrous. There are 2 main subtypes of fibers, loose and dense. Loose is further divided, more subtypes, into areolar, adipose, and reticular. So loose connective tissue, the areolar, this is the tissue that's composed of collagen and elastin fibers. It's a soft gel-like matrix. It connects body structures together. It's underneath almost all epithelial tissues. It surrounds blood vessels, nerves, the esophagus, and the trachea. It can be described really as a loose arrangement of collagen fibers, elastic fibers, and cells. Adipose connective tissue, that's really fat cells, forms supporting protective pads around the kidneys and around some other structures. It's also, those of us who are a little overweight, we have adipose tissue deposited all over our bodies. It can also act as a storage depot for excess food, hence the overweight, and it can help insulate the body to conserve body heat. The reticular loose connective tissue, it's a loose network of reticular fibers and cells. It forms the framework of the spleen, the lymph nodes, and the bone marrow. Its function is to support the blood-producing cells and the immune cells. Dense connective tissue, this is the tendons and ligaments. These are the cord-like structures that attach muscles to bones. That's the tendons. And the ligaments attach bones to bones. I haven't been able to come up with an easy way to remember that. You just have to kind of memorize it. Tendons are muscles to bones, and ligaments are bones to bones. They don't really have a rich blood supply. In fact, they really have few blood tissues. So when you injure a tendon or cartilage, it takes longer to heal than another part of your body might. Dense connective tissue also forms bands or sheets called fascia that bind together organs and muscles. It forms a protective capsule around kidneys, spleen, and nerves. It's also around some muscles. Like if you think about when you buy meat in the store, there's a thin whitish film that's around the outside of the meat. That's the fascia. It's strong, but it's flexible. So cartilage, remember this tends to be kind of rubbery and flexible. Tendons and ligaments have a limited blood supply, but cartilage has no blood vessels supplying it. It gets its nutrients and oxygen from the connective tissue around it. So torn cartilage takes even longer than tendons or ligaments would. Sometimes healing doesn't happen at all because it doesn't have its own blood supply. And here we go with more subtypes. There's 3 different types of cartilage based on where they are found in your body. The hyaline cartilage, the hyaline cartilage is found at the ends of movable joints, like in the knees. It's also found where the ribs attach to the sternum. It's in the larynx, and it's in the supportive rings that are around the trachea. It provides support, but it's flexible and makes joint movement easier. Elastic cartilage is found on the external ear. It provides flexible support. And then the last one, fibrocartilage, that's found between the discs of the vertebrae, inside the knee joint and the pelvis. Its function is to resist compression and absorb shock, which kind of makes sense if you think about the vertebrae and the cartilage in between them. Another type of connective tissue, I love Ahmed, is bones. Bones are a type of connective tissue. Another name for bones is osseous tissue. It's composed of bone cells called osteocytes. Osteocytes are embedded in a matrix that contains collagen fibers and mineral salt crystals. It's those crystals really that what makes the bone hard. And when we look at the skeletal system in a few weeks, you're going to learn about how bones are constructed and broken down in the body. And you're going to learn a lot of the names of the bones that week. Bones form the skeleton of the body, and they act to provide structure, support, and protection for internal organs like the brain and the lungs. They also have attachment points for muscles, which are what makes movement possible. They're a storage place for calcium. And then some of the bones have the bone marrow, which produces new blood cells. Bones do have a rich blood supply, so injuries heal a lot quicker than cartilage, tendons, or ligaments. Although if you've ever had a fracture, you know it takes about 6 weeks or so, which really seems like a long time when you're waiting for them to heal. The last type of connective tissue is blood. It's really weird. We don't always think of blood as being a connective tissue, but it is because of the liquid matrix. It doesn't contain any fibers, but it's composed of various types of blood cells that are surrounded by the liquid matrix, which is the plasma. It's found within blood vessels throughout the body, traveling throughout the body. The function of blood is to transport oxygen, nutrients, hormones, and waste from one part of the body to the other. And we'll learn more about that when we do the cardiovascular system. All right, so we've talked about epithelial tissues, we've talked about connective tissues, and all the subtypes and subtypes and subtypes of subtypes. Another type of connective tissue is nervous tissue. Nervous tissue has a high degree of excitability and conductivity, more so than really any other tissue in the body. If you think about what your nervous system does, it kind of makes sense. That's what makes it able to communicate so quickly with other parts of the body. Nervous tissue is found in the brain and the spinal cord and the nerves. And of course, there's more subtypes, 2 types of nerve cells. The neuron, this is really the functional cell of the nervous system, and we're going to learn that when we do the neurosensory. It's characterized by a cell body with 1 axon and 2 or more dendrites. You don't need to really know that, which was which this week, but when we do the nervous system, you will need to know that. And then the neuroglia are special nerve cells that connect and support the neurons and help the neurons get their nourishment. All right, so last type of tissue we're going to talk about is muscle tissue. And of course, we have types and subtypes. So the first type of muscle tissue is skeletal. Just like the name says, it's muscle that is attached to the bone. It's what makes body movement possible. It's responsible for breathing, for speech, control of urination, and facial expression. It's also responsible for heat production and eye movements. And heat production, if you think about it, if you exercise and you're using a lot of muscles, you get very warm. It's because those muscles are producing heat. Skeletal muscle is voluntary, which means we can control how and when those muscles move. It's composed of long, thin cells. You remember that back in cells when we looked at the cell shape. Long, thin cells called muscle fibers, and they're known as, they look striped, so we call them striated, because if you look at them from a distance, they kind of look like they have stripes. And lots of times, skeletal muscle fibers will have more than 1 nucleus. Smooth muscle. This type of muscle is involuntary, meaning you can't really consciously control what it does. Muscle cells appear smooth, they're long and narrow, but not as long as skeletal muscles. They're not striated, hence the name smooth. They're found in like the walls of blood vessels, hollow organs like the intestines and along the digestive tract. It's the contraction of the smooth muscles of the digestive tract that help propel food through the GI system. The smooth muscles in the blood vessels help to control the diameter of the blood vessels, which controls your blood pressure. And you also have smooth muscles in your respiratory tract. Contraction of these muscles can impair breathing, which can lead to difficulty breathing and asthma attacks. But again, you can't really control those. You can't consciously say, I'm going to make my blood vessels get smaller in diameter because I think my blood pressure is low. So that's why they're smooth muscles. The last type of muscle is cardiac muscle. This is also a smooth muscle because you can't really control how fast your heart beats or how it beats. But it does have faint striations like a skeletal muscle The unique characteristic of the cardiac muscle is the intercalated discs that it has, which helps the electrical impulse travel faster between the cells. And you need that electrical impulse to travel to cause the muscle to contract and make your heart beat. So that's the difference between cardiac and skeletal and smooth. So the last thing we're going to talk about here is tissue repair. There's really 4 steps in tissue repair process that happens when there's an injury or there's a tear in the skin. And remember, when we're talking about skin, we're talking about epithelial tissues. This epithelial tissue regenerates while the underlying tissue heals by fibrosis. So the first thing that happens when a cut occurs in the skin is the broken blood vessels bleed into the wound. The stopping of bleeding is another whole process. We're not going to talk about that here. We're going to get to that when we do blood. In the process of stopping the bleeding, a scab forms, and beneath that scab, white blood cells begin to ingest bacteria and cellular debris. The healthy tissue around the cut or the tear that sends blood, nutrients, proteins, and other materials that are needed for growing new tissue to the damaged area. This newly formed tissue is called granulation tissue. And this is important to know when you get to wound care in the med-surg later in the program. Contained in this granulation tissue are cells called fibroblasts. These cells secrete collagen that then forms the scar tissue inside the wound. The last step is that the surface around the wound generates new epithelial cells, which then migrate below the scab and eventually loosen it so it falls off and reveals new functional tissue. So let's review. We've talked about epithelial tissues, squamous, cuboidal, columnar, both simple and stratified. And we also talked a little bit about pseudostratified. We talked about connective tissues, fibrous, loose and dense, and then we talked about cartilage and the 3 types of cartilage. We talked about bone, blood, also connective tissues, and then we talked about nervous tissue and muscle tissue. And then the last thing we talked about was the steps in tissue repair. I know it's a lot to remember. I didn't intend for this to be 22 minutes long. You will find that the summary has all this information on, but feel free to go back and replay and take notes. And hopefully we're going to have a scavenger hunt as part of our lab that will help you remember some of these things. And that's it. Thanks.